Hey guys, tonight we're headed to a quiet little village in rural Japan, deep in the winter of the 1980s. Imagine snow piles so high it covered the mailbox, and the world outside was completely still, just white on white muffled silence, and the crunch of boots when someone passed by. You might not have experienced this before, but there's a kind of magic that fills the air when snowflakes drift endlessly from the sky, making everything feel like it's waiting for something wonderful to happen. You're tucked in now, I hope blanket pulled up to your chin, lights dimmed, maybe a little sleepy already. If so, perfect, because tonight's story is a memory from my childhood, back when my brother and I decided to build something that would outlast winter itself. Or at least that's what we thought. It didn't quite go as planned. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy these sleepy little stories. It really helps the channel, and I love having you here. All right, now let's get into today's diary entry. I must have been about 10 or 11 when it happened. My brother Kenji was 2 years older, which meant he got to act like the boss, especially when our parents weren't around. That winter was the heaviest snowfall we'd had in years, maybe decades, people said. The entire landscape was blanketed in thick snow so deep that when we stepped off the back porch, it swallowed our boots up to the knees. Kenji and I had been cooped up inside for 3 days already, and cabin fever was starting to set in. We tried everything: card games, shadow puppets, building towers with rice crackers, and even seeing who could whistle with a mouthful of sweet potatoes. None of it was working. Then on the fourth morning, the snow finally stopped. The sun peeked out like a bashful guest, the sky turned a soft, dreamy blue, and the world outside sparkled like someone had sprinkled diamond dust over everything. That's when Kenji got his big idea. "We should build an igloo," he said. I blinked at him, like Eskimos. He rolled his eyes. "They're called Inuit." But yeah, like that. With a dome and a tunnel entrance and everything. We could even sleep in it. Now, neither of us had ever seen an igloo in real life, much less built one. But something about the idea felt right. It wasn't just about making something cool. It was about finally doing something memorable, something bold and silly and big. Our yard stretched out behind the house like a frozen field. No fences, no boundaries, just a wide open canvas of white. It was perfect. I still remember how my breath fogged up in front of me as I stared across that field, imagining the igloo standing proud like a snow palace. We didn't waste any time. Kenji grabbed 2 plastic beach buckets from the shed, and I found a tiny snow shovel our dad used to keep in the back of his truck. With our tools in hand, we marched outside like 2 miniature architects about to change the world. Our plan was simple: make bricks out of packed snow, stack them in a circle, and keep stacking until we had a dome. Easy, right? Except snow doesn't really like being shaped like bricks, especially when your tools are meant for sand. The first few hours were chaos. Kenji kept yelling instructions like he was a general leading a siege. "No, pack it harder, or that's too skinny." Meanwhile, I was crouched in the snow with frozen fingers, trying to pat snow into perfect rectangles that immediately crumbled like sugar cubes. We spent all morning digging, packing, and arguing. At one point, Kenji got so frustrated he threw a snow block at a tree, and it exploded in a puff like powdered sugar. "It's the snow," he muttered. "It's too fluffy." Still, we didn't stop. The sun was already past its peak when we finally managed to stack a circle of maybe 7 snow bricks. They looked like lumpy pillows, honestly. But to us, it was the foundation of something grand. I remember standing back to admire our progress. My gloves were soaked through. My nose was red and drippy, but I felt a flicker of pride. We were doing something. Our neighbor, old Mrs. Tanaka, watched us from her kitchen window with a mug of tea in her hands. She didn't say anything, just smiled and shook her head like she'd seen 100 snow forts rise and fall. "Tomorrow," Kenji said, his breath puffing clouds in the cold air, "we finish it. We're gonna make the best igloo this village has ever seen." I nodded even though I could barely feel my toes. As the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the snow, we finally trudged inside, cheeks pink and boots soggy. Our mother nearly screamed when she saw the state of us. She made us strip off our wet clothes at the door and handed us hot towels and steaming mugs of barley tea. We wrapped ourselves in blankets and sat near the heater like two thawing potatoes. That night as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought about the igloo to be. It didn't matter that it barely had a base. In my mind, it was already done, round, solid, glowing from within. A secret fort, a castle of snow. And tomorrow we would make it real. The next morning, I woke to the sound of shoveling. At first, I thought it was a dream, some rhythmic crunching noise that blended perfectly with the softness of my futon and the fading memory of whatever I'd been dreaming about. But it kept going. Crunch, scrape, thump. I rubbed my eyes and sat up. The sunlight filtering through the shoji screen was pale and sleepy, like it hadn't had its tea yet. I shuffled to the window and peeked outside. There was Kenji already knee-deep in the snow, a bucket in one hand and a ladle in the other. A ladle. I got dressed faster than ever, thermal socks, 2 layers of shirts, the itchy scarf my aunt had knitted, and raced out the door, nearly slipping on the steps. Kenji turned to me with a triumphant grin. "Look," he said, holding up the ladle like it was a sacred artifact. "It makes perfect snow domes. Watch." He plunged it into the snow, scooped out a mound, and gently plopped it down onto the growing wall of our igloo. Sure enough, it was a tidy little dome shape. "It's not bricks," I pointed out. "I know, it's better," he said. I wanted to argue that a bunch of scooped snow blobs wouldn't hold, but, well, it did look fun. And we weren't exactly engineering students. So I grabbed a rice paddle from the kitchen, don't ask how it ended up in the snow gear bin, and joined him. What followed was a flurry of activity, both chaotic and strangely joyful. Kenji and I moved like tiny snow robots, scooping, packing, placing. Occasionally a wall section would cave in, and we'd groan, then laugh, then rebuild. It became a kind of rhythm, make, collapse, giggle, repeat. At one point, Kenji decided we needed reinforcements. "Let's go ask Kenta and Yuki," he said, referring to our neighbors 2 houses down. I wasn't sure if they'd want to help. We were all still on winter break, and I imagined they were buried under their own heaps of boredom, but it was worth a shot. We put down our tools, if you can call ladles and paddles tools, zipped up our jackets tight, and trudged through the snow down the lane. The cold air stung my cheeks in a way that felt oddly good, invigorating. Like winter itself was watching us amused. Kenta opened the door wearing ski goggles and holding a grilled sweet potato like it was a trophy. When we explained our mission, his eyes lit up. An igloo with tunnels. Yuki was less convinced. "You know that stuff collapses, right?" Kenji puffed his chest a little. "Not this one. We've got a new technique." So now there were 4 of us, all with makeshift scooping gear. Yuki had a ramen bowl, and Kenta brought an old rice mold that made smiley face onigiri, which absolutely did not work, but looked hilarious in the snow. The teamwork brought new energy. We started giving names to the tools. Kenji's ladle became the chief, and my rice paddle was the architect. Kenta's mold was the disappointment, which even he admitted was accurate. With 4 pairs of hands, the walls began to rise, lumpy, uneven, but undeniably taller. We decided to leave a small opening on the side for a tunnel entrance, but that turned into a bigger debate. "It should curve," Yuki insisted, "like a proper entrance." "No way," Kenji argued. "Straight tunnel. Efficient." "Efficiently boring," Kenta mumbled. So we compromised a slightly curved tunnel, barely long enough to crawl through. It looked like a snow mole had sneezed into the side of our structure, but we loved it anyway. By early afternoon, we were sweaty inside our jackets and laughing at everything. Every time someone slipped or a snowball smacked someone's back, it became a joke that echoed through the neighborhood. Even old Mrs. Tanaka brought out some steaming cups of Amazaki sweet rice drink on a tray, balanced carefully in her mittens. We thanked her profusely, our fingers tingling as we clutched the warm paper cups. "This reminds me of 1954, she said wistfully. "We made a snow cafe right in this same yard, sold pretend noodles." "You had customers?" Yuki asked. "Only the neighbor's dog," she replied with a wink. We returned to the igloo with red cheeks and renewed ambition. As we began adding the upper layers, still just scoops really, it became clear the shape wasn't quite right. It leaned a little. The top had a dip. One side bulged out like it had too much lunch. But it was ours, and every added scoop made us feel like we were carving something magical out of the frozen world. Then came the final argument of the day. "We should name it," Kenji said. No, Yuki countered. Naming it will make it fall down. It's like a curse. Kenji crossed his arms. We have to name it. It's practically a citizen now. Kenta, ever the diplomat, suggested, how about we call it Nameless Igloo? And somehow that stuck. The Nameless Igloo stood proudly in our yard, glowing pink in the late afternoon sun. By sunset, our gloves were stiff and our noses numb. But we stood around our creation, sipping the last of the Amazaki, quietly admiring what we'd made. Tomorrow we promised each other we'd go inside. Tonight we let it sleep. The next morning I woke up to the sound of something clattering in the kitchen. It was still dark outside, but the smell of miso soup was already drifting into the hallway. I shuffled in, eyes barely open, and saw my brother hunched over a pile of gear. He had the flashlight strapped to his forehead like a miner, a scarf wrapped 3 times around his neck. And in his hands he was holding something I hadn't seen in years, a battered aluminum rice pot with a dented lid. What are you doing? I mumbled, still half asleep. Getting ready, he whispered. We're reinforcing the igloo today. With soup. He rolled his eyes. No. This is for shaping the snow. The base is round, right? The rice pot's perfect. I already tested it on the back porch. Plus, it's heavy enough to compress the snow just right. I blinked at him. You tested it? When? About an hour ago, he said, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Didn't you hear me outside? No, I didn't. But that explained the faint crunching noises I had half dreamed about. He tossed me a scarf and said, come on, we've got a lot to do before sunrise. So there we were, back outside before breakfast, standing in the cold, with a rice pot, a ramen bowl, and 2 plastic shovels we'd borrowed from Kenta's dad. The snow sparkled under the early morning sky, a silvery blue stillness that made everything feel like it was paused. The nameless igloo had survived the night. It looked a little slouched, sure, and the entrance tunnel had one side drooping like a tired eyebrow, but the structure itself was holding. See, still alive, Kenji said, patting it proudly. We gotta work. Kenji handled the rice pot he'd packed snow into. It'd press it down with the lid, then turn it over like a sandcastle bucket. I focused on scraping the inner walls with the rice paddle, smoothing out the edges and clearing room for what we called snow furniture. Basically just mounds we could sit on without getting too wet. After about 20 minutes, we heard the crunch of boots coming from the road. It was Kenta and Yuki carrying more supplies, a cooking tray, a broken dustpan, and a pair of soup ladles. You're late, Kenji called. We brought upgrades, Kenta shouted back, and breakfast. Yuki handed me a steamed bun wrapped in a napkin. It was warm, soft, and filled with sweet red bean paste. I swear it tasted like victory. With our strange collection of borrowed and improvised tools, we turned the inside of the igloo into something surprisingly comfortable. It wasn't huge, you could fit 4 of us in there if we squeezed, but it was just enough to sit cross-legged backs against the curved wall, with a tiny snow shelf in the middle where we placed our flashlights. We even dug out a little skylight, more like a hole really, right above the center, letting in a beam of cold morning light. It gave the whole space a peaceful, otherworldly glow. Then, of course, came the problem of the back wall. Kenji had the brilliant idea to carve in a window, but once he scraped too much part of the wall, gave out, and snow tumbled inside right onto Kenta's lap. He squealed and jumped like he'd been attacked by a snow monster. We had to spend the next hour rebuilding that wall, this time without any windows. Around noon, the sun started getting a little stronger. Not warm exactly, but enough that we noticed drips forming on the roof. Just tiny ones, nothing alarming yet. Kenji brushed it off. It's fine. That just means it's packing itself tighter. But I wasn't so sure. Snow and sunlight never got along for long. Still in that moment, sitting inside our lumpy dome, sipping hot barley tea from thermoses, and watching our breath curl in the air, it felt like we had built something real. Something from nothing. I wish we could sleep out here, I said quietly. Kenji nodded. We will, maybe tonight. Yuki raised an eyebrow. You two actually want frostbite? Kenta grinned. Only if we get snow pancakes in the morning. By mid-afternoon, we had finished reinforcing the walls, reshaping the tunnel entrance, and even carving our initials into the inside like explorers leaving proof of their expedition. I carved mine too, just a little M near the door beside Kenji's, Kenta's lopsided K again, and Yuki's tidy little Y at the top. Then because we had nothing else to do and didn't want to leave yet, we lay back in the snow heads, sticking out of the tunnel, watching the clouds drift across the sky. At one point, Kenji murmured, "We should write a book about this." About what Yuki said. This he said, motioning to the igloo, the snow, the sky. Us, the nameless igloo, the whole adventure. I'd read that, I whispered. We stayed there until the sun began to dip, the shadows growing long and blue across the snowfield. Our breath was starting to fog up the tunnel. It was time to head home. Same time tomorrow, Kenta asked. Earlier, Kenji said. We're finishing the roof. But little did we know the nameless igloo was already starting to change. Snow may be magical, but it has a short memory and a shorter lifespan when 4 kids are stomping in and out with cooking gear. Still, that day felt like something etched in time. Just 4 kids in a snow dome that held together a little longer than it had any right to. The next day began with quiet excitement. Unlike the previous morning, the sky was clouded over, and everything felt softer, like the whole world had hit a snooze button. The snow was still there, thick and untouched, but the air had that strange, damp heaviness that told us the weather was thinking about changing. Still, Kenji was undeterred. We finished the roof today, he declared as we pulled on our jackets. We're sealing it shut. You say that like it's a spaceship, I said, yawning. He just nodded with a serious look, like he had a launch schedule to stick to. When we arrived at the nameless igloo, it was still standing barely. The tunnel entrance had slumped a little more, and the upper edges of the dome looked like they'd started sagging inward. The little skylight we'd made was now an open mouth drooling snowflakes into the middle of the floor. Kenji stood in front of it with his hands on his hips. She's aging. We gotta act fast. Kenta and Yuki arrived about 15 minutes later this time, with actual tools, a wooden board, a garden trowel, and a laundry basket full of extra gloves and snacks. We figured we'd need reinforcements, Kenta said, tossing me a pair of dry mittens and snacks. Yuki pointed at the igloo. Looks worse than yesterday. It's fine, Kenji said quickly. Once we cap the top, it'll lock in the structure. That was his new theory. If we sealed the roof completely, the internal pressure would somehow hold everything together. I didn't quite get the physics of it, but I liked the confidence. So we got to work. Kenji stayed on the upper deck using the rice pot to pack thick snow slabs around the edges of the open top. I stayed inside, smoothing out the ceiling and catching falling clumps with the laundry basket. Kenta and Yuki worked on reshaping the tunnel again, now calling it the grand entryway. The snow had turned stickier, maybe from the slight rise in temperature, so the packing went better. We managed to form a narrow ring around the dome's top, tightening the hole bit by bit until there was only a small opening left. We need one final piece, Kenji said dramatically. Like a capstone, Yuki asked. Exactly, one perfect dome, like an upside-down bowl. We all paused thinking. Then I held up the actual upside-down bowl I'd been using to scoop snow. What about this? Kenji took it, filled it with packed snow, and carefully turned it over in the middle of the ring. We all held our breath. The piece sat there wobbling slightly, then settled. And just like that, the roof was sealed. We burst into quiet cheers, trying not to shake the structure with our celebration. It felt like something sacred, this goofy, lopsided igloo built out of kitchenware and teamwork. Inside it was darker now, lit only by the faint glow from the little window slit we'd made earlier. But it was warm in that frozen kind of way. Kenji sat down in the corner and leaned back against the wall, sighing, like a man who'd just completed a masterwork. We did it. Can we sleep here tonight, I asked. Yuki and Kenta both looked at each other. Kenji hesitated. We might have to. We all laughed. But part of me hoped we actually would. We stayed inside for a long time that day. Played a game where we had to guess what shape someone made in the snow with their gloves. Tried to make snow tea by burying a bottle of barley tea under the dome's floor and pretending it brewed. We told stories, some real, some made up, and carved tiny snow animals along the ledge inside. Around mid-afternoon, we heard crunching from outside and peeked out through the tunnel. It was Mr. Yamamoto, the old man who lived near the footpath. He was bundled in layers with a scarf wrapped up to his nose and a floppy fishing hat on top. He squinted at our igloo. You kids live in that thing now. Kenji crawled out grinning. We built it. Want to see inside? Mr. Yamamoto nodded and knelt slowly to peek through the tunnel. He chuckled softly. Not bad, not bad at all. Reminds me of '62. Big storm that year. My brothers and I made one that fit 8 people until it melted into a puddle overnight. You ever sleep in it, I asked. Oh, sure, he said. Coldest night of my life. Woke up with my foot in a snow puddle and a frozen rice ball in my jacket. We all laughed. He stood and dusted off his knees. Just don't seal yourselves in. That's a mistake we made too. Thanks for the tip, Kenji said with a mock salute. Mr. Yamamoto shuffled away, still muttering stories about his igloo days. As we packed up for the afternoon, we felt different, like we were part of something older. Like we joined a long line of silly kids who thought snow could be shaped into something lasting. The nameless igloo was complete, at least in our eyes. But later that evening, as we looked out the window from the warm kitchen, we noticed the clouds had thickened. The wind had picked up, brushing little gusts across the field. And the snow, it had begun again. Big, heavy flakes, the kind that didn't float. They landed with intent. Kenji leaned closer to the window and said half to himself, she might not make it through the night. I turned on the porch light. The nameless igloo looked small in the dark, but somehow braver than ever. Like it knew. That night, I couldn't sleep. Even though the house was warm and the kotatsu was humming softly in the next room, my thoughts kept drifting back to the igloo. I imagined it sitting there under the snowfall, our little creation, quiet white, slowly disappearing under fresh layers. Around midnight, I gave up trying to rest. I slipped out from my futon, tiptoed past Kenji's room, and made my way to the kitchen. The snow was still falling steadily outside the window, and in the pale glow of the porch light, I could just barely make out the curved hump of the igloo across the yard. It looked smaller now, or maybe just softer, like someone had taken a blanket and draped it lovingly over it. I stood there for a long moment, forehead pressed to the cold glass, listening to the quiet. Then on impulse, I pulled on my thick socks, grabbed my scarf, and bundled myself up. I opened the sliding door, slowly wincing as it creaked. The cold hit me instantly sharp, but somehow refreshing. The snow crunched under my feet as I made my way through the yard. I didn't even bother with boots, I was already committed. My breath came out in clouds and the snowflakes drifted into my hair, clinging like little stars. When I reached the igloo, I crouched down at the tunnel and peeked in. It was dark, of course, but dry. The inside still held its shape, the snow walls glowing faintly in the light from the house. I pulled my flashlight from my coat pocket and clicked it on. Its beam danced across the walls, revealing our tiny carvings, the initials, the snow shelf, the uneven dome with the bowl-shaped cap still miraculously intact. I crawled in slowly, my knees sinking into the packed snow. Once inside, I sat cross-legged, flashlight propped up on the shelf, casting shadows around the chamber. It was quiet in there, perfectly quiet. The snowfall outside muted all sound, and the walls insulated me from the world. Just me and the breathy hum of winter, and the faint memory of laughter still lingering in the air. Then I heard a crunch outside. I froze. The tunnel darkened, and I saw a familiar silhouette crawling in behind me. Kenji. He gave me a look like I'd just stolen the last mochi. I knew you'd come out. You were awake. He shrugged, brushing snow from his sleeves. Heard the door. Figured if you were going, I might as well too. We sat there for a while, neither of us saying much. The flashlight flickered a little, and Kenji adjusted it. You think it'll still be here tomorrow? I asked quietly. Kenji looked up at the ceiling. Maybe, maybe not. Doesn't matter, really. How can it not matter? Because we built it, he said, tapping the wall gently. We were here. Even if it's gone tomorrow, we'll remember. I thought about that for a while, about how things could disappear, but still feel permanent somehow. I think I understood what he meant. Outside, the snow was coming down heavier now, the flakes hitting the roof with soft little thuds. The cold was starting to creep in through our clothes, but neither of us moved. Then Kenji pulled out a thermos from his jacket. Cocoa. You brought cocoa. Never leave the house at midnight without cocoa, he said matter-of-factly. He unscrewed the lid and poured some into the cup. Steam curled into the air, and the scent of chocolate filled the tiny space. I took a sip. It was still warm, sweet, and slightly gritty, the way homemade cocoa always is. We passed the cup back and forth in silence. For a moment, the igloo didn't feel cold at all. It felt alive, like it was listening. Kenji looked at me and grinned. You know, we could add a chimney. No, just saying, a little one. You'll collapse the whole thing. He held up the empty cocoa cup in mock surrender. Okay, no chimney. Eventually the flashlight dimmed too much to be useful. We turned it off and sat in the faint light filtering through the snow walls. Time moved differently in there, slow, thick, soft. We started talking quietly. About school, about summer, about whether Mom would let us go fishing again this year if we promised not to lose the bait bucket like last time. Then Kenji asked, you think next year we could build a bigger one, like with rooms and bunk beds made of ice? Exactly. We'll need a whole team, recruits and blueprints and probably better gloves. Definitely better gloves, I said, flexing my numb fingers. After a while, the cold finally convinced us to leave. We crawled out one after the other, snow clinging to our knees. The wind had picked up, and the flakes were swirling sideways now. I turned back to look at the igloo one last time. It stood there under the falling snow, its shape softened, but still, solid, still ours. We didn't say anything more. Just walked back inside, shivering boots squeaking on the floorboards. We stripped off our wet layers, tiptoed back to our rooms, and slipped under our covers like nothing had happened. But something had. That night, under a sky filled with snow, we'd shared something simple and quiet. A moment that would melt like everything else, but never really disappear. The next morning was strangely bright. The sun had returned, casting a golden glow across the snow-covered yard. It glinted off every surface so intense it almost hurt my eyes when I peeked through the shoji. I blinked a few times, letting them adjust, and then I saw it. Or rather, I didn't. The igloo. I scrambled to my feet, heart suddenly pounding. I pushed open the front door and stepped into the cold. The air was crisp and quiet, birds chirping somewhere off near the cedars. The snow from last night had settled thickly on everything, smoothing out every edge, every bump. The nameless igloo had collapsed. Not entirely. A soft mound still sat where the dome had been, but the roof had caved in. The tunnel entrance had been erased by the fresh snowfall. It looked like a sleeping whale buried in a white sea. Kenji came out behind me, still pulling on his sweater. Oh, he said, rubbing his eyes. She's gone. I stood there in silence for a while. I thought I'd feel crushed, like something had been taken from us. But looking at it now, I didn't feel sad. Not really. She made it longer than I thought, I said. Kenji nodded. She lasted 3 whole days, that's a record. We didn't move for a bit, just watched the sunlight shift across the snow. Then Kenta and Yuki showed up, both holding snow shovels and wearing matching frowns. She's down, Kenta asked. Caved in, Kenji confirmed. Peacefully, Yuki asked. As far as we can tell. We all stood in a line at the edge of the yard, staring at the lumpy shape like we were at a funeral. I think she deserves a send-off, Kenji said finally. A snow ceremony, I asked. No, he said, his eyes lighting up. A celebration. And that was how the nameless igloo's wake turned into the first ever Igloo Meltdown Festival. We ran back inside, grabbed all the supplies we could find, bamboo skewers, a grill pan, leftover mochi, a bag of old crackers, even some dried squid snacks our uncle had left behind. We dragged a folding table outside and set it up on the back porch. Mrs. Tanaka saw us from her window and came over with a tray of sweet potato slices and a thermos of green tea. Kenji wrote names igloo 198X, 109X in the snow with a stick. We didn't remember what year it was exactly, so we just put X. Kenta made little flags out of chopsticks and paper scraps, planting them like snow country banners near the ruins. Yuki arranged the snacks on plates like it was a royal tea party. And then we grilled. We roasted mochi over the grill pan, letting them puff up and brown just a little at the edges. When they got too sticky, we dropped them into tiny bowls of soy sauce and sugar. We laughed when Kenji dropped his into the snow, then wiped it off and ate it anyway. This is what she would have wanted, he said solemnly. Mrs. Tanaka sat in a folding chair wrapped in a checkered blanket, sipping her tea and nodding in approval. I've seen plenty of igloos, she said, none with a farewell party. At some point, Yuki handed out little strips of paper and told us to write messages. To leave something behind, she said. Mine read, thanks for the quiet nights. Kenji said, "Next time we'll build you bigger." Kenta's just had a drawing of a snow dome with arms flexing. Yuki's was neat and simple, we remember. We folded the papers and tucked them into the snow near the base of what remained. The sun kept shining. Little by little, the mound began to melt just barely. Drips formed along the edges. The top slumped in like the igloo had finally exhaled. No one seemed in a hurry to leave. We took turns telling stories not just about the igloo, but about all the silly things we tried over the years. The time we built a raft out of plastic bottles that sank instantly. The time we tried to camp on the porch, but got scared by a raccoon. The snowball fight that ended with Mrs. Tanaka joining in and winning. We laughed and sipped tea and watched the snow soften around us. Eventually, Mrs. Tanaka stood up, brushed the crumbs from her lap, and said, "You should build another next year, but maybe make it a snow cafe this time." She waved and headed home. As the sun began to dip, we packed up the table, gathered the wrappers, and stood in a small circle one last time. Kenji saluted the lump. "Rest easy, nameless igloo." We all nodded. Then we turned and walked back to the house, leaving behind a mound of snow that looked like nothing to anyone else but meant the world to us. That night I fell asleep with the scent of grilled mochi still clinging to my hair and the memory of a soft, snowy shelter lingering in my dreams. It was gone now, but in a way it never would be. The days after the nameless igloo melted passed quietly. The snow remained thick on the ground, but it started to change no longer. The fluffy, playful snow perfect for scooping and shaping. It became heavy and dense, the kind that crunched under your boots and stuck to your pants. The kind that signaled the tail end of winter. Kenji and I still went outside, though not as often. The igloo had been our grand event of the season, and afterward, everything else felt smaller. Not boring exactly, just slower, like our imaginations had run out of steam for a bit. We spent more time inside playing cards by the heater, sneaking extra Sembe crackers from the pantry, and making paper airplanes that never quite flew straight. Every now and then, I'd catch Kenji looking out the window toward the spot where the igloo had once stood. He never said anything, but I could tell he missed it too. One afternoon, while cleaning out the cupboard near the back door, I found the rice pot we'd used. It was still a little damp inside, with a clump of half-melted snow stuck to the corner. I sat on the floor, holding it like a time capsule. Kenji walked in and saw me with it. He grinned. "The hero returns." "Barely survived," I said. "May need retirement." He took it from me and inspected it like a relic from a museum. "We should write the name on it." "The nameless igloo." He nodded. "Exactly." So we did. With a permanent marker, we wrote the words in big wobbly characters on the side. "The nameless igloo. Winter Project 198X. Then we stuck it high on the shelf above the back door, where all the old junk ended up, next to a cracked umbrella and a dented watering can. It felt right. The following week, we had a few sunny days. The snow began to recede slowly but surely. Patches of brown grass peeked through near the stone path, and the sound of dripping water filled the gutters. Spring was on its way, whether we were ready or not. One evening, as the sun set over the hill and cast long shadows across the garden, Kenji and I sat on the porch with mugs of warm milk. The air smelled like melting snow and damp wood. The ground was still wet, but I could already imagine the first crocuses pushing through the soil. "You think we'll ever build another?" I asked. "An igloo," he said. "Yeah, bam." Kenji sipped his milk and looked out at the yard. "Not the same one," he said after a moment, "but maybe something else. Something new." That made sense. The igloo wasn't just about the snow or the shape or the goofy tools. It had been about us, about building something from nothing and doing it together. Whatever came next, I hoped it had that same feeling. The next day, we decided to clean up the last remains. The snow pile was small, now more like a soggy hill than a structure. We brought out the laundry basket, a few buckets, and our trusty ladle, the chief, as Kenji still called it. As we shoveled the last of the snow into the ditch beside the road, I found one of the paper flags we'd planted earlier. It was soggy bent and barely legible, but I could still make out the drawing, Kenta's little muscle-armed snow dome. I tucked it into my coat pocket without saying anything. Later, we told Kenta and Yuki about the cleanup. They just nodded and said we should do something better next time. Kenta suggested a snow roller coaster. Yuki wanted to build an underground snow tunnel system. Kenji was already sketching ideas in the margins of his homework. We didn't know what next winter would bring. Maybe less snow, maybe more. But we'd be ready with new plans and better gloves. The igloo was gone. But the idea of it, that sense of wonder, that quiet feeling of warmth in the middle of all the white cold that would stick with us. Sometimes I still think about that midnight moment inside sipping cocoa under the dome, the world completely quiet except for the snow falling gently outside. A small space built by kids with ladles and laughter, where time stood still. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, like someone sneaking back into a room they'd left too long ago. The snow melted little by little, revealing a yard that looked both familiar and somehow new. Our footprints had long since disappeared, erased by time and weather. The igloo spot was just a flat patch now, a little muddier than the rest, marked only by a small ring of rocks we'd placed for decoration and forgotten to remove. One afternoon, while Mom was airing out the futons and Kenji was busy helping Dad fix the garden fence, I went outside by myself and stood in that spot. I didn't bring anything with me. No tools, no gloves, no snacks. Just me and the soft wind and the memory of snow beneath my feet. I closed my eyes for a moment. I could still hear our laughter echoing through the tunnel, feel the cold, bumpy walls against my back, smell the cocoa and grilled mochi in snow-soaked mittens steaming on the porch heater. I could almost hear Kenji saying something absurd about adding solar panels to the next igloo. That strange, quiet magic still lingered. That night we had dinner on the floor in the main room, seated around the low table. Dad told a story about a kite he once got stuck in the temple roof when he was our age. Mom laughed so hard she spilled her tea, and Kenji nearly choked on his pickled radish, trying to recreate the sound the kite supposedly made when it hit the tiles. Everything felt ordinary again, in the best way. Later, I went to the back door to grab my jacket, and I glanced up at the high shelf above the coat rack. The rice pot our igloo mold was still there, sitting quiet and a little proud, with the words we'd written, now slightly faded, but still visible. The nameless igloo, Winter Project 198X. I didn't say anything, just smiled, turned off the light, and went to bed. Months passed. The seasons turned like pages in a book, quick at first, then slower and slower again. Summer came with its humid breezes and buzzing cicadas. Then autumn brought with it the earthy smell of leaves and the sound of distant drums during the harvest festival. And soon enough, the air grew colder again. Subtly at first, just a bite in the morning wind, then frost on the porch steps, then the crunch of dry grass beneath our boots. Then one morning we woke up to snow. It wasn't much, just a thin layer enough to coat the trees and soften the world. But it was enough. Kenji looked at me over breakfast and grinned. Well, he said, already reaching for his scarf. I raised my eyebrows. We doing this again? Of course, he said, this time with bunk beds. Don't forget the chimney, I added, sipping my tea. And so it began again. Not the same story, not the same shape, but the same spirit. The spirit of turning cold days into warm memories, of building something silly and beautiful out of snow, and of finding joy in the quietest corners of winter. The rice pot with the nameless igloo still sat on the high shelf above the back door, watching over us like a silent, dented guardian of winter's end. Snow was long gone by now, replaced with the kind of sticky summer heat that made our sandals squeak and the cicadas scream like tiny electric guitars. Kenji had been suspiciously quiet for 3 days. That usually meant one of two things. Either he was planning something, or he had already started and just hadn't told me yet. I found out which one it was when he burst into our room holding a rolled-up newspaper and a spoon. We're digging to Tokyo, he said. I looked up from my manga. Come again. He slapped the newspaper onto the floor and pointed at a small corner where some article mentioned a new subway line in the capital. If they can dig underground, so can we. We just do it in reverse. From here, we live in a tiny village on the side of a mountain. Exactly, we dig downhill. Gravity helps. I stared at him for a full 5 seconds. Then I said the words I always regretted. Okay, but I get the big spoon. And that was the beginning of our most ridiculous summer project. We started gathering supplies like two determined ants preparing for winter, if ants used chopsticks and old cooking bowls for engineering. The shed behind our house wasn't exactly well stocked. It held a mix of gardening tools, half-rusted bicycle parts, and a bag of onions someone had forgotten 3 seasons ago. Kenji rummaged through everything, tossing items behind him with increasing enthusiasm. Too big, too sharp, too illegal, he muttered finally, holding up a cracked tin bowl like it was treasure. This is it. Perfect for scooping. I raised an eyebrow. That's Mom's pickling bowl. She hasn't used it in months, he said, which I later realized was a wildly incorrect assumption. I grabbed 2 old chopsticks and a bent rice ladle. I'll start with these. We can dig in shifts. Smart, Kenji nodded. We'll need to conserve energy. Tokyo's far. We returned to the yard behind our house where the grass thinned out and the dirt turned into packed earth. It was a quiet spot tucked between the camellia bushes and the old plum tree. The ground was flat and shaded by early afternoon, which made it the ideal location for a highly impractical tunnel system. Kenji stood tall, hands on hips. Right here. This is where we break ground. And you're sure Tokyo's this direction, I asked, pointing vaguely southeast? He hesitated. Well, it's more of a symbolic direction. I accepted this answer without argument. Summer did things to your brain, made you more open to digging toward imaginary destinations. We started digging. Spoon bent almost immediately. The chopsticks snapped under pressure. The tin bowl did surprisingly well, though it made a loud clang every time it hit a rock, which happened about every third scoop. Still, we worked at it for nearly 2 hours. The sun climbed higher, the sweat poured faster, and our hole deepened by what felt like impressive amounts, but in reality barely made it past our ankles. Should we switch tools? I asked, panting. Kenji wiped his forehead with the edge of his shirt. Yes, and we need more people. Tokyo wasn't built by 2 kids with kitchenware. We took a break under the plum tree, drinking lukewarm barley tea from a thermos and staring at our ambitious ankle-deep crater. From above, it looked like a large footprint left by someone indecisive. We'll need a schedule, Kenji mumbled between sips. For what? Isimarnot. For shifts, planning, morale building. I nodded slowly. Do we also need a mascot? He brightened. Yes, maybe the neighborhood cat. The rest of the afternoon was spent preparing. We stole an old bucket from under the sink, cut a piece of cardboard into a sign that read, Tokyo Tunnel West Gate, and taped it to a stick. Kenji made a small flag using one of Mom's cloth napkins and planted it next to the hole. By sunset, we had dug approximately the depth of a shallow rice bowl and built enough bureaucracy to run a small company. Tomorrow, Kenji said, standing over the hole as the light faded, we dig with purpose. You mean like real digging? No, he said seriously, strategic digging. He didn't elaborate, he rarely did. But as we washed the dirt from our hands and watched the cicadas fade into crickets, I started to feel like we were on the verge of something. Something big, or at least medium-sized. That night, lying in bed with my arms sore and the scent of soil still clinging to my hair, I imagined Tokyo waiting patiently on the other end of our tunnel. A glimmering city full of vending machines, trains, and people who would one day wonder how 2 country kids arrived beneath their feet. Digging resumed early the next morning, right after breakfast and before the heat could knock the spirit out of us. Kenji had brought blue chalk from his school pencil case and was now drawing crude grid lines around the hole, like we were mapping a construction site. Every centimeter counts, he said, squinting at the ground like a foreman, with a very small and very unrealistic skyscraper in mind. I was in charge of soil removal. My job was to scoop the dirt from the hole and toss it into a growing pile beside it, which we'd started calling Mount Exit. Kenji, meanwhile, handled the core excavation, which mostly meant poking around with the rice ladle and grunting at rocks like they were personal insults. After about 30 minutes of hard work, I stood up and stared at our progress. The hole had deepened slightly, but not by much. My arms were tired. My legs were tired. Even my ears were tired, which I didn't think was possible. Kenji crouched down, inspected a clump of clay, and said with complete seriousness, "We might be digging through ancient sediment, or someone's old laundry dump," I muttered, flicking away a bit of plastic wrapper we'd unearthed. He ignored me. The soil's compacted, probably due to centuries of natural pressure. We'll need more force, more spoons, bigger spoons. So we headed back to the shed for reinforcements. Kenji came out triumphantly with a broken gardening trowel that looked more like a metal tooth, and I returned with an old wooden rice paddle that had seen better decades. We went back at it. The new tools helped, sort of. The paddle moved more dirt, but also splintered on the edges. The trowel cut through the clay, but got stuck on every other root. Still, little by little, the hole grew. Eventually, I got curious enough to measure it with my arm. Up to my elbow, I announced proudly. Kenji knelt beside me and frowned. That's only like 20 centimeters. Better than zero. Tokyo is 400 kilometers away. Well, I hope you packed snacks. He rolled his eyes and returned to his dirt pile. At this rate, we might get there before our grandchildren do. Despite the sarcasm, we didn't stop. We took breaks to eat watermelon slices on the porch, our hands and mouths sticky juice dripping onto our knees. We let our feet soak in a bucket of cold water while making plans for tunnel lighting. Kenji suggested glowworms. I suggested we not trap bugs underground with us. Later, we set up a little wind chime above the tunnel because Kenji said every station needs a welcoming sound. It was an old bell from my bicycle tied with fishing line to the plum tree. Whenever the wind stirred, it rang once, a thin high note that sounded like a mouse hiccuping. The wind chime rang twice as we returned to digging that afternoon. It felt like a blessing. But just as we started making real progress, at least by our standards, the dirt changed. Suddenly, it wasn't soft clay anymore. It became dry, powdery, and stubborn. We'd dig a scoop only for the sides of the hole to crumble back in. This is sabotage, Kenji declared, wiping sweat from his brow. The dirt is fighting us. We should have brought a vacuum, I said, already exhausted. He leaned over the edge of the pit, one hand on his hip, the other shading his eyes like an explorer. I think it's time we bring in reinforcements. You mean ask Kenta and Yuki? He nodded solemnly. We'll need extra hands and rations. So we abandoned the work site for the day, gathered what little pride we had left, and marched off toward the neighbors' houses. The tunnel may have only been elbow deep, but in our minds it was already the beginning of something vast. Something people would one day talk about, or at least trip over. By the next morning, the mission had officially become a group project. Kenta showed up with a beach bucket, a toy rake, and a bag of dried squid snacks. Yuki brought 2 small plastic shovels, and for some reason, a tiny red flag attached to a chopstick. Every expedition needs a marker, she said, planting it next to our original napkin flag, which had flopped over in the humidity and now resembled a tired jellyfish. Kenji, as always, took charge. Welcome to Tunnel HQ, he announced, gesturing to our ever-expanding mess of tools, buckets, and dirt piles. Today we implement Phase 2. Phase 2, Kenna echoed, mouth already full of squid snack. Kenji pulled out a wrinkled piece of graph paper from his pocket and unrolled it on the ground like a blueprint. It was covered in crooked line circles and an arrow labeled Leads to Tokyo. See here, he said, pointing to a squiggly line that looped underneath several boxes. This is our main shaft, and this is the detour that runs under the schoolyard. Yuki squinted. Why are we going under the schoolyard? In case we need snacks from the canteen, Kenji replied without missing a beat. I leaned over the paper. Is that a tiny bathroom? It's a theoretical model. You drew a couch. We'll be down there a while. We all nodded because somehow it made perfect sense. Armed with our new tools and dubious architectural plans, we returned to the tunnel. With 4 of us working in shifts, the hole finally grew past knee depth. We took turns digging, scooping, smoothing the walls, and carrying dirt to Mount Exit, which was now beginning to resemble a small volcano. Kenta insisted we build perimeter defenses with sticks, while Yuki reinforced the tunnel entrance using wet leaves and flattened soda cans. Just in case of a cave-in, she said extremely seriously. Despite the absurdity, it started to look real. Not an actual tunnel to Tokyo, of course, but a legitimate effort, a project that had shape and teamwork and goals. Sure, the goals involved breaching hundreds of kilometers of Earth with a rice paddle and a beach bucket, but they were goals nonetheless. Things were going surprisingly well until Kenta struck something. Thunk. We all froze. Kenji rushed over and crouched beside the hole. What was that? Kenta stood up slowly, wide-eyed. It's something hard, like metal. I think I found treasure. I peeked into the hole and saw it a flat, rusted surface half buried in the dirt. Kenji gasped, "A time capsule." "No way," I said. "Probably a can lid." Yuki knelt and dusted around it with her fingers. "Wait, there's something stamped on it." Kenji squinted at the rusted edge. "It says Nissan." We all paused. Kenta blinked. "We just discovered instant noodles." After a good 30 seconds of silence, Kenji stood, brushed himself off, and declared, "We've reached the snack layer of Earth." That broke everyone. We laughed so hard, Kenta fell backward into the dirt, and Yuki snorted loud enough to scare a crow off the roof. I sat back on my heels, wiping tears from my cheeks, realizing I hadn't laughed that hard in weeks. Even if we weren't digging a real tunnel, we were uncovering something else, something better. Like the layers of summer itself, quiet boredom followed by imagination, followed by nonsense and joy. After the discovery of the noodle relic, morale surged. We built a small shelf into the side of the tunnel and placed the rusty lid there like a museum piece. Kenta dubbed it the golden plate of Tokyo's gateway. Kenji revised the blueprint to include the artifact. Yuki added a new flag beside the shelf. I suggested we start charging admission. The day passed quickly after that. The sky turned golden and soft. The shadows stretched. Our limbs were tired, our faces sunburnt, and our fingernails permanently stained brown, but none of us wanted to leave. That evening, as we sat on the porch, slurping real instant noodles and watching the fireflies blink to life, Kenji leaned over and whispered, "We're getting close. I can feel it." "To Tokyo?" I asked. He shook his head. "To something. I don't know what yet, but something." And I believed him. The next morning, something had changed. Not with the tunnel exactly. It was still roughly knee-deep and leaning slightly to one side, but with our neighborhood. Word had gotten out. It started with Takumi, the kid from 3 houses down. He showed up just after breakfast wearing a bright orange bicycle helmet and carrying a plastic sandbox shovel. Behind him came Miko and Hana, the twin sisters who often played tag with their eyes closed, a dangerous but entertaining sport. Then Daichi, who brought a toy megaphone and absolutely no tools whatsoever. By mid-morning, the backyard had become a small excavation festival. Kenji was thrilled. "This is how real infrastructure begins," he said, pacing with a clipboard he had fashioned from a cereal box and tape. Kenta and Yuki tried to organize the chaos, but it was like herding bees. Kids were digging new holes, comparing findings, mostly rocks and bottle caps, and staging pretend construction accidents. Someone taped 2 chopsticks together to form a microphone and began interviewing workers about their progress. "Excuse me, sir," said Hana, pointing her fake mic at me while I shoveled how far until we hit ramen. "Hopefully before my arms fall off," I replied. She nodded solemnly and scurried off to report the news to Miko, who was balancing a juice box on top of the Mount Exit dirt pile and calling it a vending machine. Kenji, meanwhile, stood over the original tunnel like a proud architect watching his building survive a mild earthquake. He had redrawn the blueprint to include emergency ladders, secret passageways, and a gift shop. "Phase 3 begins now," he announced. "What happened to Phase 2, I asked. "That was yesterday. With so many hands working, we made progress, at least in terms of width. The main tunnel became broader rather than deeper. It looked more like a large ditch than an entrance to an underground metropolis, but none of us seemed to care. What we lacked in engineering, we made up for in enthusiasm and snacks. Someone's grandma brought out barley tea and rice crackers. We passed them around like precious cargo. A few kids built tiny chairs out of dirt and leaves, calling them break rooms. There was a half-hour period where everyone abandoned the digging entirely to play tunnel train, which mostly involved shouting choo-choo and running in circles. And then came the unexpected moment that shifted everything. Miko screamed, a loud, sharp yelp that froze all of us mid-laugh. "What happened?" Kenji rushed over. "It moved," she shouted, pointing into one of the side holes. The dirt moved. We all gathered around, squinting at the area she'd indicated. Nothing happened at first. Then wiggle. Something under the soil shifted slightly. A soft squirm like pudding beneath a spoon. Kenji leaned in. "I think we've hit a tunnel worm." Yuki frowned. "That's not a thing." Kenta added, "What if it's a mole?" Takumi pulled off his helmet, or buried treasure that wriggles. We watched with bated breath. And then from the soft patch of earth emerged a turtle, tiny, muddy, and completely unimpressed by the squeals of delight that followed. It blinked at us slowly, turned its head, and began walking away at the speed of regret. Everyone followed it for a moment, keeping a respectful distance, as it ambled toward the plum tree, paused beneath a leaf, and settled in for a nap. Kenji clapped his hands. Ladies and gentlemen, I present the Tokyo Guardian. The turtle was instantly voted the project mascot. Someone built it a miniature throne from popsicle sticks and placed a cucumber slice beside it like an offering. The tunnel suddenly had a soul. For the rest of the afternoon, we worked in quieter joy, like we were part of something ancient and slow and peaceful. Every scoop of dirt felt important. Every rock felt like a step closer to our dream. By evening, most of the extra kids had gone home, leaving only the four of us. The yard was a mess, holes everywhere, trampled grass tools scattered like breadcrumbs. But we didn't care. We sat on the edge of the main tunnel, feet dangling into the cool dirt, watching the sky go from orange to purple. Kenji pulled out a flashlight and shone it down into the hole. You know, he said softly, we might never get to Tokyo. I looked over at him. Yeah, I know. But I think we found something better. I nodded because I felt it too. We hadn't built a tunnel to Tokyo. We built a summer worth remembering, and a place where even a turtle could become royalty. The next day began with the scent of rain on the wind. Not the dramatic kind that comes with thunder and lightning, but the quiet sort, thick gray clouds rolling in over the hills, the air damp and slow. Everything felt hushed, like even the cicadas had taken the morning off. Kenji was already outside, crouched beside the tunnel, drawing circles in the dirt with the tip of a stick. I walked over, careful not to disturb the maze of side holes and mounds that now filled half the yard. Storm's coming, I said. I know, he replied. We might have to suspend digging operations, like a weather delay. He nodded. Tunnel command can't risk soggy ceilings. We both glanced down at the hole. The bottom was still dry, but the dirt had darkened. It wouldn't take much rain to turn it all into mush. Our dream of Tokyo might soon dissolve into a muddy footbath. The turtle, still perched beneath the plum tree in its makeshift popsicle stick fortress, didn't seem concerned. Kenji had named him Shin Tokyo. He'd barely moved since yesterday. Yuki and Kenta arrived not long after, each holding an umbrella and looking grim. We brought reinforcements, Yuki announced, pulling a folded plastic sheet from her bag. Waterproofing. You're serious, Kenji said, eyes gleaming. We came prepared, Kenta added, flashing a roll of duct tape and a sandwich. For the next hour, we worked to weatherproof the tunnel. It was, to put it kindly, an optimistic effort. We covered the opening with the plastic sheet, pinned it down with rocks, and reinforced the sides with sticks and half a broom handle we found behind the shed. Kenji declared the site officially protected and even made us chant a brief oath swearing loyalty to Tunnel Command and the turtle. But the sky grew darker. The wind picked up. And then came the first fat drop of rain, landing right on my nose like a punctuation mark. We scrambled into action, checking the tarp, adding more rocks, reinforcing the stick supports. It all felt dramatic, like we were rescuing some sacred relic instead of a hole in the ground. The rain came harder. The wind began tugging at the plastic sheet, making it flap like a startled bird. Water trickled down the sides of Mount Exit and began pooling near the base of the tunnel. Kenta dug a small trench to redirect the water, but it filled too quickly. We tried to stay dry, but it was useless. Our sleeves soaked through, our socks squelched, my hair stuck to my forehead in wet little ropes. Still, none of us wanted to give up. Not yet. Then the wind tore one corner of the tarp free. A blast of rainwater dumped into the opening like someone had tipped a bowl. We froze. Yuki gave a small, tired laugh. Well, I guess that's that. The tunnel began to collapse in slow motion, walls crumbling, floor softening, water rising. We watched helpless as 3 days of digging turned into a soggy, swirling crater. Kenji knelt beside it, drenched, silent. His blueprint, the one he'd redrawn twice and taped to a cereal box, was a soggy mass in his back pocket. I expected him to shout or stomp or blame the weather, but he didn't. He just said, "She served us well." We held a small ceremony right there in the rain. The turtle, of course, was the guest of honor. Kenta gave a short speech about courage. Yuki presented the rusty noodle lid, which she now called the tunnel core. Kenji saluted the remains. I sang the tunnel anthem we made up the day before, mostly consisting of the words dig, dig, dig repeated to the tune of a rice cooker beep. Eventually the rain let up. The sky turned a pale watery blue. The air smelled like mud and soaked grass. We stood together cold and wet, staring at what was now just a dent in the yard. I guess Tokyo will have to wait, I said. Kenji nodded slowly, but we got close. Kenta slurped the last of his soggy sandwich and said close enough for a souvenir shop. Yuki smiled. Let's rebuild next week. Maybe dig west this time. Kenji turned to us, water dripping from his bangs. No, next time we dig up, Treehouse City. No more underground risks. And somehow that felt exactly right. The storm passed, but the tunnel never quite recovered. Overnight, the water settled into the base, turning it into a muddy soup that smelled vaguely like wet shoes and old tea leaves. The plastic tarp had blown off entirely now, dangling from a tree branch like a defeated flag. The walls that once held our hope of reaching Tokyo were gone, softened, sunken, and finally flattened. But we weren't sad, not really. The day after the collapse, the sun returned. The ground steamed slightly in the morning light, and the cicadas, ever resilient, screamed louder than ever. It was as if the summer itself wanted to remind us, this is how it goes. Build, break, laugh, try again. Kenji spent the morning digging around the shed for something new to work on. Kenta tried to turn Mount Exit into a fort by stacking dirt into walls, but it kept falling apart. Yuki sat under the plum tree sketching in a notebook. She wouldn't tell us what she was drawing, just said it was classified. As for me, I wandered. I walked the perimeter of the former tunnel zone, hands in my pockets, toes sinking slightly into the soft ground. The turtle Shin Tokyo had disappeared sometime in the night, probably off to find another group of noisy children to tolerate, or maybe just looking for someplace dry. I missed the tunnel. Not the hole really, but the idea of it. The sense of doing something ridiculous and important at the same time. That odd little magic of shared purpose of kids from different corners of the neighborhood working together under a single silly dream. Eventually, I sat near the edge of the crater, picking at the dirt with a stick. Kenji came over and flopped down beside me, holding a box of cold barley tea. "You think we could have made it?" I asked, half joking. He shrugged. "Not this summer, but maybe one day. Du söker rain in Tokyo." To anywhere, he said. We sat in silence for a while, sipping tea, watching the wind bend the grass in slow, sleepy waves. Then he pulled something from his pocket and handed it to me. It was a small, round pin, the kind you'd get at a festival. It had a faded cartoon train on it and the words, "To Tokyo Express," written in peeling red letters. "Found it in the toolbox," he said. "Thought it might belong to the tunnel." I turned it over in my palm, smiling. "It's perfect." We made our way to the back porch and took one last look at the site. Yuki joined us, holding her sketchbook, finally ready to show what she'd drawn. It was a comic. 8 panels each one, showing our adventure in exaggerated, hilarious detail. Kenji in a hard hat made of a ramen bowl. Me stuck in a mudslide. Kenta discovering golden treasure, the noodle lid. The turtle riding off like a samurai on a leaf. We laughed so hard we nearly spilled the tea. "I want to hang this up," Kenji said. Yuki handed it over like it was priceless. We tacked it to the wall inside the shed just above the toolbox. Kenji added the tunnel pin to the top corner. I found the melted tip of the old rice paddle and wedged it into the side. A shrine to the impossible built of nonsense and childhood. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and turned everything gold, we lit a few mosquito coils and sat on the porch again, barefoot and sticky with sweat, but content. Kenji leaned back, staring at the sky. "You know what? We should write down everything, all of it. The tunnel, the artifacts, the turtle, the rain, everything. Like a book." "No," he said, "like a field report." "Who's the report for?" Kenji shrugged. "Whoever finds it. Future kids or explorers, or maybe Tokyo." I nodded. "Okay, but I'm not writing the part where I fell into the hole face first." He grinned. "Too late. That's the opening chapter." We stayed out long after the stars came out, swatting bugs and dreaming up new plans. Tree houses, floating rafts, time machines. Things that felt just as impossible as a tunnel to Tokyo, but maybe not completely out of reach. A few days later, summer began its slow goodbye. The air shifted just slightly cooler in the mornings, softer in the evenings. The cicadas still screamed, but now their rhythm felt tired, like they were winding down after a long concert. The sky seemed bluer, the shadows longer, and our time felt suddenly numbered. Kenji declared it was time for one final mission before school started again. He wouldn't say what it was. "Just meet me after lunch," he said with a mysterious grin, stuffing a paper bag with something from the kitchen and racing out the door. I arrived in the backyard to find him crouched beside the old tunnel site, now nothing more than a shallow basin filled with dry grass and faded memories. He had cleared a small section and was laying something out on the ground. It was the tunnel field report. He'd taken pages from his old math notebook and written out everything: dates, findings, silly diagrams, incident logs, and notes like mole, citing unconfirmed but probable. At the top, he'd written in blocky letters, "Operation Tokyo Final Entry." I knelt beside him, stunned. "You really wrote all of it?" "Of course," he said, brushing off his knees. "We owe it to the tunnel." He handed me a small envelope sealed with tape. "Put something in. Doesn't matter what." I thought for a second, then dug into my pocket and pulled out the train pin and the one he'd given me. It felt right. I placed it in the envelope and sealed it again. Kenji placed the envelope at the center of the report, then rolled everything into a tight bundle and wrapped it in 2 layers of plastic. Then came a shoebox and finally a small wooden crate he'd scavenged from the storage room. "What now?" I asked. "We bury it," he said, "deep as we can, beneath the original dig site." So we dug. Not with spoons or rice paddles this time, but with one of Dad's real shovels. It felt heavier, more serious, like this was no longer a game. We dug until we reached the old dirt, dark and cool and slightly damp. Then Kenji placed the box inside gently, like laying something to rest. We covered it with soil, then stones, then finally a small wooden board, painted with our names. We stood back and stared at it in silence. Yuki arrived a little later, holding her now complete comic pages, laminated and folded like a booklet. She laid a single drawing beside the board, one of the turtle in its throne, wearing a crown made of leaves. Kenta showed up last, bringing nothing but a juice box and a solemn look. "I missed the ceremony." "You're just in time for the after party," Kenji said. We sat in a circle around the little grave, sipping juice, sharing stories from earlier in the summer. The failed kite experiment, the misfired watermelon cannon, the day Kenji tried to make ice cream by spinning a bowl in the river. The wind picked up a little, rustling the grass. We talked until the sun began to dip again, painting the sky in soft colors that looked like sherbet and peach tea. The tunnel was gone. The artifacts were buried. The dirt was flat again. But everything still shimmered with memory. Eventually, our parents called us in. We stood, brushed off our pants, and said quiet goodbyes, not just to each other, but to the summer itself. As we walked back to the porch, Kenji paused and turned to me. "You know," he said, "we may never dig another tunnel." I nodded. "That's okay. But one day," he said, "someone will find that box. And maybe they'll keep going. Maybe they'll make it." Kenji smiled. "Yeah, all the way to Tokyo." The summer faded the way a song fades slowly, gently, with a few quiet notes trailing behind long after the music stops. The hole in our yard was gone, smoothed over by time and weather. The grass grew back unevenly, curling around the edges of the buried box. The wind still passed through that space, sometimes soft and warm, as if it remembered everything that had happened there, as if it carried a little of our laughter, our sweat, and our silly big dreams. Even now, sometimes I find myself sitting at the edge of that old patch of ground, remembering how the dirt felt beneath my hands, how the sun turned the sweat on my face into glitter, how we believed, truly believed, that we could dig all the way to Tokyo. And maybe that belief was the best part. We didn't get there, of course. We never even made it past shin level. But we found something else: joy and shared effort, magic in the mess, and something surprisingly deep in a hole that was barely knee-high. When the days grow long again and the summer buzz returns to the trees, I know we'll be out there once more. Maybe not digging, maybe not tunneling, but building something always building, in dirt or paper or memory. And maybe, just maybe, that old turtle will wander back, settle under the plum tree and listen in. Until then, sleep well, dream deep, and keep your imagination just beneath the surface, ready to dig when the time feels right. End of script. Sweet dreams.